It was a Friday evening, the kind where the rain taps against your windows with a gentle persistence that makes you grateful to be inside. I had just settled into my apartment after a particularly exhausting week at work, the kind that leaves you mentally drained but physically restless. My apartment wasn't anything special. A one-bedroom on the third floor of a converted brownstone in a neighborhood that was neither trendy nor neglected, just comfortably anonymous. I decorated it with more care than I sometimes admitted to friends, creating a space that felt like an extension of myself. Bookshelves overflowing with novels I'd read, and ones I promised myself I would, plants that somehow thrived despite my inconsistent attention, and photographs from trips that reminded me there was a world beyond my daily routine. The rain had started as a drizzle in the afternoon, but had gradually intensified, and now it drummed steadily against the fire escape, creating a soothing white noise that made me feel cocooned in my solitude. I'd changed into sweatpants and an old university hoodie, poured myself a glass of red wine, and was debating between starting a new series on Netflix or finally opening that novel my friend had insisted would change my perspective on relationships. There was something about rainy evenings that made me contemplative, more aware of my aloneness. Not necessarily in a sad way, but in a way that made me take inventory of my life, my choices, and the paths not taken. I was just about to settle on the couch when I heard it, 3 distinct knocks on my door. Not the hurried, impatient knocks of a delivery person, nor the familiar pattern of a friend who'd visited before. These knocks were deliberate, confident, as if the person on the other side knew exactly what they were doing, disturbing my peaceful evening. For a moment, I froze, wine glass halfway to my lips. I wasn't expecting anyone, and in a city where unexpected visitors were rare, my curiosity immediately wrestled with caution. Setting down my glass, I approached the door, my socked feet silent against the hardwood. There was no peephole, one of the charming but impractical features of the old building. So I called out, trying to sound more assertive than I felt. "Who is it?" "Someone who clearly didn't check the weather forecast," came the reply, a voice I didn't recognize, but that carried a warmth and humor that somehow disarmed my wariness. There was something in that voice, a blend of confidence and vulnerability, that made me reach for the chain lock before I'd fully decided to open the door. When I did, I found myself face to face with him. He stood in my doorway, hair plastered to his forehead, rainwater dripping down his face and neck, soaking the collar of his button-down shirt which clung to his shoulders. His eyes met mine immediately, and there was something in them, a sparkle of mischief, perhaps, or the reflection of the hallway light, that made my breath catch slightly. "I would apologize for dripping all over your welcome mat," he said, gesturing to the small puddle forming beneath him. "But I think that's what welcome mats are for." He ran a hand through his wet hair, sending droplets flying. "Though I suppose you might offer me a towel, but that seems like something for later, doesn't it?" And then he smiled, not a practiced smile meant to charm, but something more genuine, as if we were already sharing a private joke. I found myself smiling back before I could analyze why. "Do I know you?" I asked, though I was certain I didn't. He wasn't someone I would have forgotten. "Not yet," he replied, "but I'm hoping to change that. I'm your new neighbor, just moved in downstairs yesterday. 2B. He extended his hand, then looked at it, dripping wet, and laughed. "Maybe we skip the handshake for now. I'm Alex." I hesitated for just a moment before introducing myself. There was something disarming about him that made the usual urban caution I carried seem suddenly excessive. "I'm Jordan," I said. "Did you need something? Besides a towel, which apparently is for later?" I couldn't help but reference his odd comment, which hung between us like a playful challenge. "Actually, I locked myself out," he admitted, looking slightly embarrassed but not particularly concerned. "The super isn't answering his phone, and I remembered seeing your light on when I was struggling with my keys. Thought maybe I could use your phone to call a locksmith, or wait here until the rain lets up a bit before I try breaking into my own apartment." I found myself stepping back from the doorway, making space for him to enter. "Come in," I said, surprising myself with how easily the invitation came. "You're creating a small lake out there." He stepped in, careful to stay on the entryway rug. "I promise I'm not usually this much of a disaster," he said, though something in his tone suggested this might not be entirely true. Or maybe I am, but I usually hide it better until at least the third conversation. As I closed the door behind him, I became acutely aware of how intimate my apartment suddenly felt with this stranger in it. The space that had seemed so comfortable in my solitude now felt charged with a new energy. I could smell his cologne, something citrusy and subtle, mingling with the scent of rain. It was an oddly appealing combination. "Let me get you that towel," I said, moving toward the bathroom, regardless of whether it's for now or later. I grabbed my fluffiest towel from the linen closet, hesitated, and then grabbed a second one. When I returned, he was standing exactly where I'd left him, respectfully not venturing further into my space without invitation. I handed him the towels, and he took them gratefully, immediately rubbing one through his hair. "Thank you," he said, his voice slightly muffled by the towel. "You're saving me from both pneumonia and looking like a drowned rat." He lowered the towel and looked at me, his hair now sticking up in all directions, giving him a boyish, disheveled appearance that was strangely endearing. "I think the drowned rat look was actually working for you," I said, surprising myself with the flirtatious tone that had crept into my voice. "But this is an improvement too." He laughed, and I noticed how the sound seemed to fill the room, warm and genuine. "I'll take that as a compliment," he said, draping the towel around his shoulders. "Though I should warn you, I clean up even better than this." There was a moment of silence, not awkward but charged with something I couldn't quite name. I realized I was staring and quickly gestured toward the living room. "You can sit down if you want. I was just about to open a bottle of wine. Or I can make coffee if you prefer something warm." "Wine sounds perfect," he said, following me into the living room but stopping to remove his wet shoes before stepping onto my area rug. It was a small gesture of consideration that I appreciated. "Though I should warn you, I'm even more charming after a glass of wine. It might be dangerous." I found myself laughing as I headed to the kitchen to grab another glass. "I think I can handle dangerous," I called over my shoulder, aware that I was flirting back and not entirely sure why. There was something about this unexpected encounter that felt like a scene from a movie, the kind where a chance meeting changes everything. When I returned with the wine, he had settled onto one end of my couch, the towel still around his shoulders. He'd rolled up the sleeves of his wet shirt, revealing forearms with a light dusting of hair and a watch that looked vintage, the kind passed down through generations. I handed him the glass and sat on the other end of the couch, tucking my feet underneath me. "So," I said, taking a sip of my wine, "you just moved in yesterday and you're already locked out. Not a great start to life in the building." He shrugged, the motion casual and somehow elegant. I prefer to think of it as an accelerated way to meet the neighbors. Much more efficient than baking cookies and going door to door. He took a sip of his wine and nodded appreciatively. "This is good. You have excellent taste." "In wine or in letting strangers into my apartment?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Both, clearly," he replied without missing a beat. "Though I should point out I'm not a stranger anymore. I'm Alex from 2B, with questionable weather preparation skills but excellent appreciation for fine wine and kind neighbors." I found myself relaxing into the conversation, the initial awkwardness of the situation melting away. "So what brought you to this building?" "This neighborhood isn't exactly the most exciting in the city. That's actually why I chose it," he said, his expression becoming more thoughtful. "I spent the last 5 years in a neighborhood where something was always happening. Parties until dawn, street festivals every weekend, constant noise and energy. It was exciting at first, but eventually exhausting. I wanted somewhere I could actually hear myself think." He glanced around my apartment. "Somewhere I could have space for books and plants and quiet evenings." I followed his gaze around my living room, seeing it suddenly through a stranger's eyes. The carefully arranged bookshelves, the collection of plants on the windowsill, the throw blanket draped over the arm of the couch. "Well, you've come to the right place for quiet evenings, though they're occasionally interrupted by dripping wet neighbors." He laughed again, and I found myself noting how his entire face transformed when he did, eyes crinkling at the corners, a small dimple appearing in his left cheek. "Only on special occasions," he assured me. "I do own an umbrella, believe it or not. It's just currently sitting by my front door, inside my locked apartment. Very useful there," I teased, taking another sip of wine and feeling a pleasant warmth spreading through me that wasn't entirely due to the alcohol. "Extremely," he agreed. "Almost as useful as I am at remembering keys." He shifted slightly, and I noticed he was still in his wet clothes, the shirt clinging uncomfortably to his shoulders. You must be freezing, I said, suddenly feeling like a terrible host. I could lend you something dry to wear. I probably have sweatpants and a t-shirt that would fit. He looked surprised by the offer, then grateful. That would be amazing, actually. I was trying to be stoic about sitting here in wet clothes, but I'm failing miserably. I set down my wine and stood up. Stoicism is overrated, I said, heading toward my bedroom, especially when pneumonia is on the line. I rummaged through my drawers, finding a pair of sweatpants that had always been too big for me and a plain t-shirt that I sometimes slept in. When I returned to the living room, he was standing by my bookshelf, examining the titles with genuine interest. "You've read all of these?" he asked, turning to take the clothes I offered. "Most of them," I admitted. "Some are aspirational." He nodded as if this made perfect sense. "The bathroom?" he asked, and I pointed down the hall. While he changed, I refilled our wine glasses and tried to process the strangeness of the situation. I had let a stranger into my apartment, a very attractive stranger, but a stranger nonetheless, and now he was changing into my clothes in my bathroom. It wasn't something I would normally do, and yet it felt somehow natural, as if the rain and the unexpected knock had created a pocket of time where the usual rules didn't apply. When he returned, the sight of him in my clothes created an unexpected flutter in my chest. There was something intimate about it, seeing him in the soft gray t-shirt that I'd worn countless times. The sweatpants were slightly short on him, revealing a strip of ankle, but otherwise fit well. "Much better," he said, settling back onto the couch, this time a little closer to my end. "Though I feel like I should be paying you rent at this point. Using your phone, wearing your clothes, drinking your wine. Consider it a welcome to the building package," I said, handing him his refilled glass. "Though I should warn you, not all neighbors are this accommodating." "I should hope not," he replied, his eyes meeting mine over the rim of his glass. "I'd hate to think you let just anyone in during rainstorms." There was something in his gaze that made my breath catch slightly, a directness that was both challenging and inviting. "Only the ones who make interesting comments about towels being for later," I said, trying to maintain the light tone, but aware that something had shifted in the atmosphere between us. He smiled slowly, acknowledging the reference. "Ah, that. I should explain that I have this terrible habit of saying whatever pops into my head when I'm nervous." "You were nervous?" I asked, genuinely surprised. He had seemed so confident standing in my doorway. "Terrified," he admitted with a laugh. I was standing there dripping wet, looking like a complete disaster, knocking on the door of someone I'd never met. "And then you opened the door, and—" He paused, taking a sip of his wine. "And you were not what I was expecting." "What were you expecting?" "I don't know. Not you." He said it simply, but there was a weight to his words that made them feel significant. Not someone who would make me immediately forget that I was soaking wet and locked out of my apartment. I felt a blush rising to my cheeks and was grateful for the dim lighting in the room. "Well, you weren't exactly what I was expecting to find at my door either," I admitted. "No? What were you expecting? Pizza delivery? Publisher's clearing house with a giant check?" I laughed, relaxing back into the easy banter. "Definitely not a dripping wet neighbor with cryptic comments about towels. Life's more interesting with a little mystery, don't you think?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't just talking about towels anymore. I found myself nodding, aware that the space between us on the couch had somehow decreased, though I couldn't remember either of us moving. "I suppose it is," I agreed, "though I usually prefer my mysteries in book form, safely contained between covers." "And yet here you are," he said softly, "letting a mysterious stranger into your apartment during a rainstorm. That's not very contained." "No," I admitted, "it's not. I'm not usually so spontaneous." "I'm glad you were tonight," he said, and his hand moved slightly on the couch, his fingers now just inches from mine. "I'm glad you opened the door." I was suddenly very aware of my heartbeat, of the sound of the rain against the windows, of the warmth of the wine in my system, and the even warmer presence of him beside me. "I'm glad I did too," I said, and was surprised by how much I meant it. There was a moment of silence, filled only by the sound of the rain and our breathing. Then he spoke again, his voice lower than before. "I should probably call that locksmith," he said, though he made no move to reach for his phone. "Probably," I agreed, equally motionless. His eyes held mine, and I saw in them a question, an invitation. "Or," he began. "Or," I echoed, barely above a whisper. Or I could stay a little longer. We could finish this wine. Talk more. See where the evening goes. His fingers moved slightly closer to mine on the couch cushion, not quite touching but close enough that I could feel the heat of his skin. I knew I was at a crossroads. The sensible thing would be to help him call a locksmith, send him on his way with his now dry clothes, and return to my quiet evening alone. But there was something about him, about this unexpected connection, that made me want to choose the less sensible path. I'd like that, I said, and watched as his expression softened into a smile that made my heart skip a beat. Good, he said simply, and finally bridged the small gap between our hands, his fingers lightly touching mine in a gesture that was somehow more intimate than if he'd kissed me. Because I'm in no rush to leave. As the rain continued to fall outside, creating a cocoon around my apartment, I felt something shift inside me, a willingness to let go of caution, to embrace the unexpected, to see where this strange, rain-soaked evening might lead. And when his fingers intertwined with mine, I didn't pull away. Instead, I leaned slightly closer and said, "So, about those towels being for later." He laughed, the sound warm and inviting, and I knew that whatever happened next, opening my door to this wet-haired stranger had already changed something in me, had reminded me that sometimes the most beautiful moments come when we least expect them, when we open ourselves to possibility and let the rain wash away our carefully constructed routines. "I have a confession," he said, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of my hand. "That line about towels, it wasn't just a random thought. When I saw you standing there in the doorway, all I could think was that I wanted to stay, to have a reason to be in your space longer than just borrowing your phone. The towel comment was my awkward way of suggesting I might be around long enough to need one later." "That's quite presumptuous," I said, but I was smiling, charmed by his honesty. "Presumptuous or optimistic?" he countered, raising an eyebrow. "I prefer to think of it as the latter." "And are you feeling optimistic now?" I asked, surprising myself with my boldness. His eyes held mine, serious despite his smile. "Very," he said softly, "though not just about towels anymore." The rain continued to fall outside, but inside, something warm and unexpected was blooming, a connection that had started with a knock on my door and was now unfolding into something neither of us could have predicted when the evening began. And as I sat there, my hand in his, I found myself grateful for forgotten keys, sudden rainstorms, and the courage to open a door to the unknown. Total _char_count, 18,724.